Welcome to the Mavarick Podcast. Today we're discussing how carbon data is moving from a risk to a real advantage. And to help us break it down, we're joined by Jamie Riley. So Jamie, to start, could you share a bit about your background and what first drew you into tackling carbon and supply chain data challenges?
Yeah, so thank you very much for having me. So my background started in retail. I started working for John Lewis at the beginning of my career. I then moved into working in the world of perfumery and aftershave manufacturing. Worked as a trainer and educator and a salesperson in relation to that. It was during that sort of time that I started to take a bit of an interest in exactly what the environmental impact of the packaging that we were manufacturing and producing perfumery and beauty products in. Following that, I then took an interest in exactly what it is that we're able to do to make packaging more sustainable. So that led me to look for opportunities that worked in the world of packaging. I joined Berry Global, who have now become since Amcor, but Berry Global joined them in relation to trying to advise with customers looking at plastic packaging tax and making their products more sustainable. So by being able to use my background in both the commercial sales side of things and also sustainability, I guess the interest in where I am today is looking at using sustainability as a sales tool to try and enhance a business's profile, but also reducing its embedded carbon footprinting, things like this. So that's kind of what's brought me from my humble days of working in John Lewis kind of way through to working for a packaging company now in the world of sustainability.
And why is visibility and alignment of data becoming such a strategic priority across industries?
So I think it's because we've got to a point where packaging generally is as cheap as it possibly can be. We've had an awful lot of drive to make packaging and consumer goods as cheap as possible, to make them more attractive for brands and retailers, things like this. And carbon data and the embedded carbon footprint of packaging that is being produced is something that can give a competitive edge over a company that isn't able to produce something with lower carbon footprinting. So if you're producing one particular product right now today, and another competitor of yours is able to make that with a lower carbon footprint, that product is essentially the same, but the environmental impact of that packaging is less. Therefore, that becomes more attractive. So it's a positive drive towards carbon reductions and net zero, where we're seeing that packaging companies are using sustainability generally, but specifically carbon, as an added on sales benefit. The idea being that if I can demonstrate for my customers that I'm able to produce a piece of packaging for them, but also have it with a lower carbon footprint than a competitor, in theory, they choose my business over one of the others.
When did you start to see carbon move from a compliance topic to a genuine driver of competitiveness and investment?
So I can almost pinpoint to not quite the day, but the moment when it first really became something of note. And it was a couple of years back. In the world of packaging, the way it works is a brand or a retailer will put out to tender to various packaging companies. They require this packaging under this spec, give us your delivery protocol, delivery times, costings, those sort of things. This particular tender also included a fairly largeable chunk of information requesting, can you tell us what the embedded carbon would be and what you as a business would be able to do to try and reduce that? And that was really the first thing. And just to put that in perspective, this was a big global pharmaceutical manufacturing company. So the sort of company that you imagine doesn't necessarily think about the environmental side of things. So to have a big multinational company like that include in their business tender the idea that you could win this business if you could offer something which has a lower carbon footprint than another business you're up against to in the tender, that was really a turning point moment from there. And it was from then you then start considering what exactly is it that I can do to demonstrate not just good delivery times, good customer service, good product design, but also carbon reduction design within that packaging as well. So that was the moment. And following that, increasingly so, if you imagine a business tender is 4 pages long, you often used to get a footnote at the bottom say, we agreed to do by the environment, tick box. Now you'll start to see that that is actually increasing as business tenders go along, and actually contracts are being drawn up to actually include, you will supply me with a product carbon footprint. You will work with me towards my net zero targets. So by being able to do that, you're able to then actively showcase to that customer that you are in agreement with them, and they can hold you to it. They can hold you accountable, which is great. So it is no longer a nice to have, it's a must have in the world of packaging business.
What do you think is the biggest obstacle to gathering consistent, reliable carbon data across complex supply chains?
I guess as you mentioned there, complex supply chains. If you are working with smaller and medium suppliers, they don't necessarily have the in-house team to be able to work on carbon data capture. They don't necessarily know exactly where to find those sort of pieces of information. The larger multinationals often have teams dedicated to be able to do this, but obviously you want a diverse supply chain. The idea as well of having to use industry average data is on the one hand great because it means that everyone is on a level playing field. But if people only ever use the average, you're never going to get to start to see a benefit of using one supplier versus another. So I guess not necessarily having in-house people being able to do it would be one factor. And just maybe the over-reliance on industry average information is there. And until recently, the likes of the PACT and ISO 16067 and those sort of guidelines that tell you what a good LCA data source looks like, there hasn't really been that before. So I'm not going to use the analogy, it's quite like the Wild West out there. It's not. But you're having to rely on somebody's own assessment of an LCA. And of course, a company's going to want to try and promote their own version. But if you can at least find a data set that's kind of quite highly regarded, which can be quite expensive, that again puts limitations on smaller and medium businesses that don't have the expertise or potentially the expense and the cost available to put towards those sort of items.
So as you just mentioned, business tenders are increasingly asking for LCA or product carbon footprint data. What's behind that trend and how ready are most companies?
So to answer your question, what's behind the trend? It's because companies now are increasingly being held to account for their actions. They're publicly disclosing their scope 1 to 3 emissions in annual reports. They're signing up to, for example, in the UK Plastics Pact or the incoming Packaging Pact. So they're making very public declarations of exactly what it is they want to true. Because consumers now are increasingly targeting packaging as the front line of sustainability, they're very much in the spotlight. They need to be seen to be doing the right thing. But the most important part is having the actions to back up what it is they're seen to be done. Now, you asked about the difference between potential certain types of customers and retailers, brands, things like this. The larger multinational companies, brands, retailers, they have teams that can try and work towards this. But the bigger the company you are, the more in the spotlight, the more pressure you're on. You look at the likes of some of the world leading brands like Unilever, Procter & Gamble. Those are very much in the spotlight constantly. So they have to be whiter than white in terms of their credentials and their traceability and their openness to be able to provide data. The smaller and medium businesses don't necessarily have that sort of focus on them, but that's where they have an opportunity to stand out amongst their small and medium competitors. Because there isn't necessarily the highlight on them, they're able to do something more. And that's where companies, for example, like Mind Robinson, they come into it. You know, they're a business that are a medium-sized enterprise, but they're able to compete with the larger companies because they're obviously realizing and seeing, hence me, my position, that actually using those sort of things in tenders is going to be a way forward.
And for those that can proactively provide this data, what kind of competitive edge does it create for them?
So it adds another dimension to, as we mentioned, business tenders and just generally how a piece of packaging is perceived. If you as a business are able to openly go to the market and say to people, not only can we make this packaging for you, but that we are able to then make that packaging and calculate its carbon footprint. And then, as part of our service to you, work on reducing what that carbon footprint would be. That's something that would give you a competitive edge over a company that simply said how much you want and at what cost and where do you want it sent. It very much is kind of coming a new opportunity in the world of economics and these sort of things. And we're seeing lots of evidence that actually companies that are progressively, actively working on reducing their own carbon footprints and wishing to work with companies that are aligned with that. We're likely to see a big push towards these sort of things. I don't know they'll ever be mandated as such in the way that you try and do this, but having carbon at the table when it comes to business is very much a way of another element of what exactly makes a good business proposition, a good business organization.
How is the value of carbon starting to appear directly in procurement and pricing decisions?
So it's interesting. I've been to a couple of events recently, and one particular example I give you is a large European-based producer of polymer resin did a presentation. And you would expect that what they'd be talking about in this presentation was this new grade of material that they had. You would expect them to be talking about the fact that it's high quality, low cost, all of these sorts of things. But no, in fact, their entire presentation was based around the fact that they believe that they can bring to market in the European Union and the UK the lowest carbon footprinted virgin polypropylene particular material available. So they're actually using that as their unique sales point. There was no reference to cost, no reference to these sort of things. It was purely focused on, if you have to use virgin polypropylene, which is predominantly what you use in food packaging due to limitations on recycled material, if you're looking to make something of polypropylene, it has to be virgin. And what I mean by virgin is new material. It's not recycled. It has to be safe. And if you're unable to use recycled content in there, the next best thing you're able to do is ensure that the virgin fossil fuel-based resin that you're using has the lowest carbon footprint to start with, because that reduces its overall carbon footprint. And this particular supplier, that was their unique sales point. And it was quite unusual to see that. And that really gave me hope and got me excited at the prospect of, okay, are we going to then start seeing resin suppliers of materials, things like this, starting to use this as the benchmark to compare themselves against each other? That's pretty exciting for me.
The monetary value of 1 tonne of carbon saved is often debated. What's your take on how companies should approach that?
Okay, so I've been asked a couple of times, and I always kind of tend to try and dodge the question of, well, you tell me how much it's worth to you as your brand. It's a difficult one to quantify. And if anyone out there listening or watching does know the answers, add it in the comments and let us know. But I think the idea of being able to calculate what that would be, a similar sort of analogy I use is often we talk about what's the saving of a forest, of biodiversity, 1 hectare of land that is saved from deforestation. What does that bring in terms of a value? Obviously, it all depends on how you perceive value and what it means to you. But the way that I would look at it is, if you can demonstrate by your own measurements, your own calculations, and you're able to share what those calculations are, that you would be looking at, okay, if I can save a ton of carbon material, and I know my customer is trying to reduce their scope 1 to 3 emissions by X%, I may be able to roughly work out what the size of their particular business is, then work out how much of their business is required to save, say, 30% on their scope 3 emissions, something like this. In theory, then, if you know how much it costs you to save them a ton of carbon, you then put it into that particular formula. And the idea being that you could then try and work out exactly what it might cost them to do so. Now, it might well be that actually they turn around and say, as is often the case, but I can't increase my prices and I have to try and do this. There might be other ways of potentially looking to work around things, such as changes to supply agreements or maybe sharing of costs. And of course, any sort of innovation that drives down the carbon footprinting, whether it be advanced molding techniques or procurement of material, which comes with a lower carbon footprint, may come with a higher monetary value. Those sort of things are, over a time period, going to decrease as they become more and more regularly available and competition drives the price down.
In packaging, carbon data often flips perceptions. For example, plastic sometimes comes out as the lower carbon option. How do you see data reframing those material debates?
So, what are the challenges of working in the packaging industry, and especially for a company like Robinson that I work for that primarily produce plastics? Is if we go to market or to a customer or at a trade fair and we try and talk about the fact that we have a piece of packaging which has a lower carbon footprint than if you were to make it out of, say, glass or aluminium or metal, something like this. The comeback is always, well, you would say that because you're the one that's making it and you have ulterior motives, such as you just want to sell more packaging. And if you want to try and compare, for example, what is the more sustainable packaging substrate, if you're looking at a glass versus aluminium versus plastic, PET, for example, what carbon should be able to offer is a way of comparing, the analogy, apples with apples. The idea is that if you can look at the carbon data for it, then that is a nice way of being able to compare exactly what the carbon footprint would be. And you mentioned there that sometimes plastic can have a lower carbon footprint in some manners. I'm not going to turn around and say that only plastic is suitable for all packaging substrates. That isn't correct. But to try and replace plastics with another, and let's take a lot of single-use packaging, for example. If you're trying to replace a single-use plastic item with a single-use something else, whether it be glass or metal or fiber or laminate, you are potentially going to be increasing its carbon emissions, its carbon footprint, without really doing too much other than simply putting less plastic on the market. And I guess one of the ways that I would hope that we'd start to use carbon, as I say, would be a way of being able to compare material substrates, alignment with that. Now, I'm not going to tell you that carbon is the only measure of the way that you look at a piece of packaging's footprint, but it is the most prevalent. It's also one of the biggest impacts. And I think what's helpful is that brands and retailers are starting to see these sort of things as a way of, okay, maybe rushing to just move away from single-use plastic to single-use other packaging. That isn't necessarily the right thing to do. And thankfully, we're starting to see a bit of a halt from that because they're starting to realize that whilst there's a bit of a perception in society, which is potentially driven by NGOs and others that potentially are well-meaning, but don't necessarily represent the full facts or the full impact of what that packaging substrate choice change would be. Yeah, it's positive. We're starting to see a change in this way.
With policies like UK EPR driving the switch from glass to PET, how can carbon accounting demonstrate both the cost and environmental logic behind these shifts?
So, the UK EPR is the bane of many brands and retailers' lives at the moment. And your reference there about the switch from glass to PET is that when the eco-modulated fees came out, glass happened to have a particularly high eco-modulation fee, meaning that brands and retailers in the UK are charged more for putting glass on the market than they would be if they made it out of plastic, for example. So one of the things that we've seen from brands and retailers is if they put a glass packaging item on the market, can that be made out of PET or alternative substrates? PET being one of the most commonly used plastics in the UK, the sort of plastic that you would find in water bottles, things like this. We're seeing a lot of brands wanting to look at that as an option, and they're looking at it, let's be honest, from a costing point of view. It is cheaper for them to put a plastic packaging item on the market than it would be a glass. Now, you might think that from a company that looks after plastics primarily, that we'd be rubbing our hands with glee and thinking, yes, great, wonderful business for us. But to me, working within sustainability within the packaging industry, and I know I can talk on behalf of colleagues of mine that work for other packaging companies, it's also important to demonstrate that actually, yes, you might be saving cost, but is there an opportunity also to design that replacement packaging to be as lightweight as possible using higher recycled content material to drive down its carbon footprint? So if you can save both the brand or retailer money on their EPR fees and legitimately prove using good data that it has a lower carbon footprint, it's a win from a business point of view, but also a win from a sustainability angle. So that's where I hope that people that are looking to make that switch realize, accept, and celebrate that that could be a solution.
Can a company really grow while reducing its carbon footprint? And what distinguishes those that succeed?
Okay, so a company can grow in terms of the money that it takes, the profit, the turnover, but it can also at the same time look to reduce the impact of the material or the packaging or the items that it produces. So the way that I think about it and the way that Robinson, my company, are looking at this is we have a mission to grow over the next 5 to 10 years. Most companies will do that. We also look to want to try and reduce the amount of carbon that would be produced for each ton of packaging that we make. The idea being that we can see a progression of profit, turnover, but at the same time, the amount of carbon produced per ton of packaging reduces over time. The idea being that if you're looking at a metric of sustainability and carbon, we are in fact reducing our impact at the same time as being able to grow. And another way that you'd look at it is, and again, this is going to seem a little odd for somebody that works in packaging, for a company that wants to grow. What the world doesn't need is more unnecessary packaging. EPR, packaging waste regulation, various legislations coming in across the world, potentially the UN Plastics Treaty, when it eventually comes into being, are likely to put pressure and potentially restrictions on the amount of packaging, not just plastic, that markets are able to put onto the market. And the sort of companies that are likely to succeed are going to be those ones that can increase their share of the pie, even if that pie is potentially going to shrink due to precious legislation. And generally, consumers may be switching to more reusable packaging, less single use. So that's how I can see that you can, as a business, want to grow and reduce its carbon footprint. And the idea is if you can win business against your competitors, as opposed to putting a more unnecessary packaging onto the market, that to me is a three-way win. It's a win for your business, it's a win for the environment, And it's a win for the brands and retailers that want to be seen to be doing the right thing, which is eliminating unnecessary packaging, looking to reduce the carbon footprint of the packaging that they are using. So that's how I see the three of them sitting side by side.
How are investors and acquirers starting to treat strong carbon reduction plans as a sign of resilience and value?
So I think, and there's various studies that you can find online, Deloitte and the likes of things, and McKinsey are able to do these sort of things quite a lot. What we're kind of starting to see is that the way that investors will go and look after companies, there's now minimum required reporting in the UK, for example, where a company, if they're looking to kind of have investors and float on the stock exchange, they have to have minimum carbon data in annual reports. Investors will look at companies that don't necessarily just have a profit growth plan, but also a plan to be more competitive in, for example, the carbon market. That's the way it is that we're seeing from a Robinson point of view. And that's where I would hope that in future, it won't just necessarily be the bottom line that a company can make, but also the environmental impact and the reduction that those can have, whether that be biodiversity, whether that be carbon or any other sort of environmental metric, that actually those ethical investors are likely to see that the companies that can tick both of those boxes, as opposed to just one, they're going to be the ones that we start to see grow.
So looking ahead now, what will define carbon competitive business over the next 5 years?
It will be the companies that are able to proactively produce product carbon footprints, LCAs, things like this. And to enable those companies to do that, they're going to have to invest. They're going to have to invest in in-house expertise to be able to do this. It's important that companies are going to be able to communicate to their internal stakeholders, mid to lower level management, even those people on the factory floors, for example, that work in manufacturing, as to the sort of actions that they can take to reduce carbon footprint, and then scale that back up to exactly why that gives them a competitive edge. What you're also going to want to have is ensure that a company is able to actively calculate that. And one of the most efficient and best ways of doing that is using expertise externally. If you don't have an in-house team that can do that, there are many, many different examples of platforms available, such as Mavarick, that are able to do LCAs, product carbon footprint, things like this, to a standard that is considered acceptable and verifiable when it comes to brands and retailers wanting to potentially make carbon claims, include the impact of their packaging in their annual reports, and market the fact that their product has been manufactured and verified to have a lower carbon footprint. So yeah, carbon is very much something that I think needs to be right the way through the business. Again, it isn't the only metric in terms of environmental impact, but for me, it's the most important one because it's the one most easily linked to, for example, climate change. So for me, that's how I'd want to see, and that's how I expect to see carbon really driving business forward. And those companies that are willing today to adapt, to invest, to engage and educate, they're the ones that are going to be able to respond quicker to customer requests. And those that can respond quicker and be seen as most knowledgeable, most supportive of their customers' goals are going to be the ones that win.
Okay, so that's it for today. Thank you to our listeners for tuning into the Mavarick AI podcast. And of course, a huge thank you to Jamie for sharing those insights with us.
Thanks very much. My pleasure.